thank you all so much for being here today. I'm Katherine Gregory, visiting assistant professor of American art at Wake Forest, and David's office mate for this past year, which I'm very lucky to be. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer Roberts is the Drew Gilpin Faust Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. She's an art historian whose research focuses on the relationship between art and the natural sciences, the history and theory of craft and materiality, and the history of printing and printmaking. A scholar whose work has often focused on American art from the 18th century through present, she has lately been taking a broader geographical and theoretical approach to her research. Roberts received her PhD from Yale in 2000 and joined the Harvard faculty in 2002. She held the Slade Professorship in Fine Arts at Cambridge University in 2019 and delivered the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art in 2021, which is a great honor in our field. These lectures, titled Contact, Art and Pull of Print, explored printmaking as an art of physical and almost intimate contact, the metaphor of pressure transfer as applied to social conflict, and the ways that printmaking has been sidelined in much art historical scholarship. Dr. Roberts is currently working on two projects that trouble the divide between the humanities and social sciences. One book will consider the relationship between art and astrophysics, and another, co-written with artist Dario Robleto, will study the EEG and EKG signatures engraved in NASA's Voyager Golden Record in 1977. This book, supported by the Sloan Foundation, explores the implications of this interstellar message within the longer history of recording graphic signals from the body. This book will be published by Scribner in 2026. Her previous research has studied a vast range of topics, and I've read it all. Robert Smithson's Mirror Travels, Jasper John's Crosshatch Works, Ruth Asawa's Botanical Sensibilities, the modes of recording bodily processes through images, the material history of visual communication, and the ways in which people transported images through early America. Lastly, Roberts is committed to linking art making, so the material knowledge and historiography, with art historical scholarship. She co-founded Harvard's Minding Making project, which hosted workshops that connected industrial or craft knowledge with fine, decorative, scientific, and industrial arts. She's currently focusing on initiatives to create alliances between the arts and humanities and STEM fields on campus and beyond. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Roberts.
Thank you so much, Katherine. Thanks to everyone for being here today. Thanks to everyone who worked to bring all of us together in this room today to conspire to honor David and his work. And I'm using the word conspire intentionally. David actually taught me what that word really means. Let's see. In the brilliant preface to his book, Shooting Kennedy, David admitted that his own method bore uncomfortable similarities to that of the conspiracy theorists that had followed in the wake of JFK's death. Like conspiracy theorists, he too had a habit of chasing after connections between stray, unrelated, seemingly insignificant details. But the word conspire, he pointed out, doesn't require that we attach sinister connotations to it. It actually comes from the Latin roots con plus spirare, meaning simply to breathe together. David's work follows from the conviction that we breathe images together. Images surround us like an atmosphere, connecting us all, getting into our lungs in ways that cannot be controlled, mingling and cross-fertilizing and intertextualizing in unruly ways. And that we need a method that is capable of detecting and exploring these connections. Because such an atmospheric method will, by definition, have to disobey the standard compartments into which we like to confine different kinds of images, such a method will always be in danger of impropriety. And those of you who know and love Shooting Kennedy the way I do, know that that book was full of such improprieties. For example, the comparison he made between Kennedy's convertible moving through the Zapruder film and the jalopy rumbling through the opening credits of the Beverly Hillbillies. I can think of no other scholar who would actually have the nerve to follow up on such an almost blasphemous insight, but David did, and in the process he provided a brilliant interpretation of the Zapruder film as tapping into broader American anxieties about wealth, chance, and mobility. In a review of Shooting Kennedy that I wish I had written, Louis Menand got at the heart of David's method. He marveled at David's way of building a history out of improbable connections that, quote, only an art historian or a Martian would notice, end quote. This insinuation that David's work performs a kind of alien intelligence seems to me to be the highest of all compliments. And it captures my own sense of the audacity of his scholarship, the way even as it emerges from a total immersion in the internalities of a culture, it still tends to produce an image of it that seems, at least at first, shockingly disorienting, unsettlingly alien. So perhaps it's not entirely coincidental, given David's enormous impact on my own work, that my current research is focused on outer space. As Katherine suggested, I'm finishing a book at the moment that, among other things, defines the process of making art as akin to the process of attempting to communicate with aliens. My paper today, however, in honor of David as a Martian, will be about Mars. It's a paper that I could not have written had I not stumbled into David's orbit during my most suggestible years as a young scholar. And there are various ways of approaching these lectures at an honorary symposium like this. Mine is to present something that I would not have been able to write without David. So the paper that I'll be presenting today is something that just couldn't possibly exist without him. One more quick note on Shooting Kennedy. Shooting Kennedy has been imprinted on me ever since I first read it in manuscript when I had first started teaching in 2002. This book taught me that it was okay to draw connections between seemingly irreconcilable phenomena, like, for example, 1960s aerospace engineering and 18th century French art, figures 52 and 82 in Shooting Kennedy, and you will see echoes of both of these in my paper today. David taught me to bristle at disciplinary divisions. His refusal to compartmentalize made it easier for me to pursue all of my own projects, attempting to build affiliations between the humanities and the STEM fields. David taught me that art history should be bold and weird and alien. He taught me that I should do what was unexpected of me. So here's a paper that is, I hope, a little bit unexpected, and I'm forever grateful to have had the chance to breathe a little bit of David's air. All right. The room is too small for the assembled crowd of men. They squeeze around desks and line up against the walls. Crew cuts, engineers' glasses, white shirts, skinny dark ties, a few suit jackets. Some of the younger men are wearing plaid shirts. There are no windows, only banks of fluorescent lights. All of the men are watching the front of the room. They stand 4 rows deep, arms crossed as if they had been there for a while, tilting their heads to try to get an unobstructed sightline. There's a palpable charge of anticipation in the air. We're in the Space Flight Operations Facility at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, also known as JPL, in Pasadena, California, on the morning of Thursday, July 16th, 1965. Two young engineers are working at the front of the crowd. One of them holds a small stick of soft pastel in a deep ochre color. With quick, gentle gestures, moving like an artist, he makes repeated short strokes across a paper surface. Switching to a loose puff of cotton, he tenderly dabs at the color. The other man holds a black pastel stick in his right hand. Some kind of class or championship ring gleams on his third finger, catching the light as he works. Both men step back for a moment to get a wider view of the developing image, and then they lean back in and continue their intimate choreography. This scene of pastel engineering is unfolding in secret in a secure location far from the public eye. Thankfully, it's being captured by a documentary filmmaker because this is a critical moment in the history of space exploration. As that pastel drawing was developing in front of them, those men were witnessing the transmission of the first image ever sent to Earth from Mars. They stood at a monumental threshold in the history of photography, of digital imaging, of space imaging, and of imaging in general. Not only were they the first humans to see the elusive surface of Mars, they were the first to see an image transmitted from any other planet, indeed from any point in space beyond the moon. Maybe this doesn't quite compute. This, the most advanced image ever yet made. It's hard to process this because it's so difficult to make sense of the mixed signals that we see in this image. Hard science entangled in a flourish of soft pastel. The masculine language of 1960s precision aerospace engineering, spoken in a powdery, precious, precarious medium associated primarily with 18th century portraiture and the delicate scribblings of women artists. The sheer impropriety of it almost blushes at its own incongruity. Perhaps this is why, despite its importance, this drawing has been almost entirely forgotten. NASA's Mariner 4 spacecraft reached Mars on July 15, 1965, after 228 days flying through interplanetary space. Having been preceded by 5 failed Soviet missions, it was the first space probe to reach the red planet successfully. And just to orient you, this is 4 full years before the Apollo landings on the moon. So this is very early in the history of NASA and JPL. It bristled with instruments, and mounted to its belly was a new thing for interplanetary science, a camera. Mariner 4 was a flyby mission with just one fleeting chance to make its observations. The spacecraft swung across the planet at almost 12,000 miles per hour, 6,000 miles from the surface. And as it did so, it quickly captured 21 images. It was just what's called a slingshot, just a glance, all over within 25 minutes. Then it slipped behind the planet and continued onward into the darkness, never to return. The photographs were stored on an onboard magnetic tape recorder to be transmitted later back to Earth. No one knew whether the camera had worked. They would have to wait for the transmission. Now, Earthlings were very, very eager to see these images because in the mid-1960s, despite centuries of observation by telescope, the nature of Mars's surface remained an almost total mystery. From Earth, even with a good telescope, Mars is hard to see and even harder to photograph. It constantly swims in and out of focus due to inhomogeneities in the Earth's optically fickle atmosphere. Moreover, the surface of Mars itself is inconstant. Blurry patterns of light and dark on the planet's face change with the years and the seasons. There are hazes and clouds and frequent global dust storms that obscure all of its features. Prior to the launch of Mariner 4, these observational challenges had contributed to widespread speculation and debate about the likelihood of alien life on the planet. Some astronomers thought they could see straight-line features swimming in and out of the blur, and the American astronomer Percival Lowell famously identified a system of what he called canals on the surface of Mars, which he took to be evidence of a vast engineering project under construction by a technologically advanced Martian civilization. This is the New York Times, August 1911. Here's one of Lowell's drawings in which he mapped out all of the civilizational canals that he saw. Now, although his alien hydroengineering hypothesis had been essentially debunked by the time of the Mariner program in the 1960s, it still actually wasn't really clear whether there were, in fact, any canal-like features on the planet. There just wasn't enough evidence to determine whether the lines that some scientists had observed were real or were merely optical illusions. In fact, the very map that NASA used to plot the trajectory of the Mariner 4 mission was based on one of Percival Lowell's with its tracery of canals encircling the planet. Now, in hindsight, with the knowledge that we now have of Mars's surface based on decades of orbiters and landers, this map, of course, looks outrageous, but it was as current as any other in 1965, and it shows how little was known of the true nature of the surface. And as for aliens, although few now believe that there was advanced alien life on Mars, it was commonly supposed in the scientific community that the planet could support some kind of life, perhaps a seasonal bloom of some kind of vegetation or colonies of small organisms. Life on Mars was a distinct hope and a distinct possibility in the mid-1960s, and one of Mariner 4's primary goals was to begin looking for that life or its traces. It was really the first scientific mission that was explicitly designed in hope of answering the question of whether Earth life is alone in the universe. So given all the stakes of the mission, it's easy to understand the bated breath in that room at JPL as the scientists and engineers waited for the images to beam down from the planet. This was, to borrow from contemporary news accounts, quote, one of the colossal cliffhangers of all time, and quote, the greatest suspense drama in the history of the space age. The problem was that they were going to have to wait for a very long time. Each photograph was digitized on board the probe at a resolution of 200 by 200 pixels. Then the numerical values for each pixel were transmitted back to Earth pixel by pixel, one at a time, at what can only be described as an agonizingly slow dribble. Each single image would take over 8.5 hours to be delivered, not including the 12 minutes that it took the information to travel at light speed between the two planets. The transmission was so slow that no single radio tracking station could receive a single image. As the Earth rotated and one tracking station rolled out of range, the next station picked up the signal. As the pixels began trickling and tickering into Pasadena, it's important to note that the data was not already in pictorial format. It arrived instead in the form of these scrolls of numbers printed out on long strips from adapted teletype machines. Now let's be clear about what this data transmission was not like. This was not a floor-to-ceiling screen displaying live imagery from space, as is shown here in a still from Dr. Strangelove, figure 72 in Shooting Kennedy. It was like this. Engineers huddled anxiously around what looks like a glorified cash register. This tiny space was their window on this mission. Consider their experience. They could tell by looking at the pixel values that thankfully the camera had captured something, but they couldn't actually envision what it was. It must have been a strange and unprecedented feeling, pulling these strips of paper from the machines to see Mars, but not to be able to visualize it, to hold Mars in the hand, but not be able to grasp it. But they were going to have to wait for the entire image to come down before a video image could be generated by the computers. Having waited already days, months, years, millennia really, for this first view of Mars, they were in no mood to wait for another 8 hours. So they decided to process the data in a more immediate way. As the teletype strips came spitting noisily out of the machines, they stapled them to a partition wall, line by line. One of the engineers drove out to a local art store and bought a box of Rembrandt soft pastels, and then the image was essentially colored by number as the data came in, with an evenly gradated run of colors assigned to represent each of 6 ranges in the pixel values. Here, they're in the process of stapling more strips onto the drawing, and the strips of numbers are being added as they come in from the radio telescope, so the drawing is literally unfolding piece by piece in chunks. They finish the left side of the image here, while the right side of the image is still flying through the interplanetary medium between Mars and Earth. So this is how the first image ever to be transmitted from another planet came to be hand-rendered in soft pastel by a group of sleep-deprived aerospace engineers in a cramped room at the dawn of the space age. Let's look at it just a little more closely. The continuous scroll of tape is cut into 200 strips, each 200 pixels high, stapled vertically to the partition wall. Each strip slightly overlaps the previous, so this is the view that you would get if you were standing at the side of the image and looking in between its strips. There are faint pencil lines provisionally demarcating the boundaries between the different pixel territories. The numeric printouts remain visible as a matrix of data shimmering and wavering beneath the pastel, so the drawing, in other words, really flaunts the aesthetics of its own digital conversion. Pastel settles around the staples, lodges on and under the edges of the strips, and captures the direction and sequence of the engineer's gestures. This is not only the first image from the surface of Mars. It's the first image in human history that can be said to have been made at an astronomical scale. Between the opening of the shutter at Mars and the visualization of the image on Earth, the data that composed the pastel had stretched over a truly unprecedented distance, 135 million miles. Images had been sent from the moon just a year earlier by an orbiter, but Mars was greater than 500 times more distant than the moon. And although I won't have time to go into this into any detail, this is also the first image ever to have been sculpted out of the fundamental cosmological limitations of the speed of light. It took 12 minutes for signals to travel between Mars and the Earth at light speed, and this had a huge impact on the design of the imaging mission and the uncertainties attending the results. And yet, for all of these superlatives, the drawing was never accepted as a legitimate image. Here is the same image when it was finally processed by a computer and officially released about 12 hours after the drawing was made. This is the photograph that was heralded as the first image from Mars. This is what became part of the record. The pastel was withheld and was quickly forgotten. For decades, it hung in an out-of-the-way hallway at JPL, where it was remembered, if at all, as a curio, a fascinating but anomalous product of the early years of interplanetary exploration. It never became part of either the scientific or the cultural narrative of modern space imaging. It has not been explored within the history of science. It has no presence in the scholarship on visual culture, media theory, or art history, even though it would have a lot to say in a conversation with Warhol's paint-by-number paintings or Vija Selmans's hand renderings of lunar orbiter imagery or early computer graphics, all of which were exactly contemporaneous with it. In the very few mentions of the drawing in period sources, there was a palpable discomfort, even embarrassment, among the engineers about the drawing that they had made. And it was not merely seen as somehow marginal or insignificant. This drawing was actually seen as potentially damaging. The public relations team at JPL, fearing that the drawing would leak out to the media, had stipulated that the engineers should stay on the far side of the partition wall, and armed guards were actually placed around the space so that no one would be able to get in and see this image evolving. But why? Why exactly wasn't it understood as a legitimate image? After all, it's rigorous, it was based on real data, it had good bones. Despite its unconventional assembly, it is undoubtedly a picture of Mars, showing the bright limb of the planet hanging down from the top of the frame. It closely matches the official first picture, even down to the black réseau marks, except that the pastel is stretched horizontally a little bit in order to accommodate the width of the printed numerals on each strip. The drawing is actually not so different from even our most advanced space telescope images today. These too are color by numbers operations. Information is transmitted to Earth in digital form from an orbiting telescope, then translated into color values, often arbitrarily, for purposes of making the data available to human perception. This is one of the first images here below to be released from the James Webb Space Telescope in 2022. It's a portion of the Carina Nebula, 7,500 light years away. You can see its kind of cliff-like wall of star-forming dust. Like the pastel, the colors of each pixel in this image were assigned and processed after the fact, according to human judgment. Like the pastel, this image is not so much a passive representation of an object in space as it is a visualization of data captured beyond the range of the human eye. Both of these images, in other words, are made up of colored grids of numbers. The main problem with the Mars image from the engineer's perspective was not so much the color by numbers process. The main problem, I would suggest, was the material. It was the pastel. The engineer who went to the art store reported that when he walked in to buy the materials for the drawing, he had asked for gray chalk. The employee apparently convinced him to buy a box of pastels instead so that he could get a better range of values for the rendering. Chalk would certainly have been more appropriate. At least then the drawing would have aligned with the conceptual spectacle of physics. But pastel, soft pastel, it's difficult to imagine a medium with more inappropriate connotations, not to mention more thoroughly beset by anachronism. The first glimpse of another world enabled by outrageously advanced engineering technology comes into being in pastel, a medium carrying a whole set of seemingly contradictory histories and connotations. The first hard data from another planet comes into view through the soft veil of a material known for its fugitivity, its fragility, its friability. Pastels are made of fine pigment powders mixed with a filler of calcium carbonate, gypsum, or kaolin. The pigment and filler are just barely held together by a binding medium, usually gum arabic. Once applied, pastel adheres only precariously to the support. It's incredibly fragile, tentative form of medium. The goal when working with pastels is to take advantage of the visual properties of this precarity, to try to retain all of that looseness and airiness of the medium, to let those fine particles float in suspension, capture the diffuse refraction of light as it bounces through the dusty layers, animating the color. To work with pastels is basically to attempt to preserve the very ephemerality of color and light, to capture a light storm. It's a medium that rewards and encourages spontaneity. It must not be belabored. Too much rubbing or abrasion will cause the pigment cloud to collapse and the light will go flat. The medium came into its own in portraiture in the 18th century because it allowed artists to capture the elusive traces of life and vivacity in their sitters. As Oliver Wunsch has shown, the friable substance became a physical surrogate for the evanescent personalities of sitters, a manifestation of the elusive soul behind the face. Pastel is a form of transitory imaging, searching, sensitive, trying to capture life on the move. This is a good time to begin noticing that perhaps in its delicacy and provisionality, pastel was actually the perfect imaging technology for the first picture of Mars. The Mars flyby, too, was a quick, fleeting encounter looking for signs of life. Pastel was treasured for its diffuseness and its indeterminacy, and this, too, accords with a planet that, as we have seen, is notoriously changeable, difficult, and fickle. Indeed, the kind of language used to describe the exquisite delicacy of pastel portraits is nearly identical to the language used to describe the surface of Mars through a telescope. If pastel is known for its sfumato, indeterminate transitions, veiled contours, diffused lighting, so Mars is subtle, ethereal, delicate, floating, at times seemingly without mass or obvious three-dimensionality. Pastel is a medium of intimacy, immediacy, sociability, passing sensations and diaphanous apparitions, a kind of luminous evanescence. Partially for this reason, it has often been associated with playfulness, sensuality, even seduction, and in the 18th century, this accounted for its increasing association with women, and indeed it was a woman artist, Rosalba Carrera, who is credited with launching pastel into the center of Rococo aesthetics. The engineers at JPL were under pressure to behave as rational men aiming at the hard facts. But to get at their data, they found themselves using a material that has long been caught up in gendered associations with vanity and artifice, fashion and frivolity, evanescence and sentimentality and longing. This is a fundamental reason for the ambivalence around the drawing, the sheer emotional extravagance of its making, the fierce impatience of it. The drawing was made of enthusiasm and desire and anticipation, all things that were supposed to be excluded from scientific representation. Even more pointedly, in the 18th century, pastel was likened to the other ways that women drew with powders. Pastel, as Thea Goldring has put it, was haunted by an association with makeup. Makeup! No wonder the engineers were nervous. Were they just adding a certain flirtatious beauty to the numbers, a form of seductive but deceptive image processing? Were they just powdering the data? Was this just makeup? Were they just making it up? If the Mariner 4 mission had been driven by a desire to explore the possibility of life on Mars, much of that was extinguished when, several weeks later, all of the Mariner 4 photographs had at last been transmitted. The images showed an ancient, cratered, tectonically inactive terrain that was similar to that of our own lifeless moon. The spacecraft was not able to detect a magnetic field, and the atmosphere was much thinner than had been expected. There were no features detected that even remotely resembled canals. Mars enthusiasts were devastated. It was, to borrow a phrase from Jim Bell, as if someone had proved that there was no Santa Claus. In the long run, actually, it turned out that Mariner 4 had simply been unlucky in its flyby. It passed over a cratered portion of the surface that was, it turns out, unrepresentative of the whole. 6 years later, Mariner 9 spent a year in orbit, mapping the entire surface of the planet. The 7,000 photographs it transmitted showed massive volcanoes, proving that there had once been abundant tectonic activity, and found canyons, riverbed structures, and other evidence that there had been abundant liquid water in the past. And this leads us to the Mars of today, which we now essentially understand as the site of a planetary environmental apocalypse. It appears to have once had abundant water on the surface, but lost it along with its atmosphere because it had no magnetic field to buffer it from the solar winds. The rovers that are now on the surface of Mars are gathering and analyzing material samples, looking for fossil evidence of microbial life that may have briefly taken hold in what had once been favorable circumstances, or perhaps even tenacious living organisms that still persist underground, protected from the deadly radiation. It turns out that Pastel has something to say about this deep planetary time as well. I've been emphasizing its affordances in dealing in very short time scales, scales of a blush or a swishing of skirts or the rapid hand gestures of an anxious engineer, but Pastel also operates on geological time scales. As early as the 18th century, artists were in a position to know this. The most abundant ingredient in pastels was calcium carbonate or calcareous earth. As Thea Goldring has pointed out, in the 18th century, calcareous earth was just being recognized as consisting of the fossilized remains of primeval marine organisms. Biomineralization in the form of shells and diatoms, seashells, etc., was and is a major source of pastel fillers. So pastel, in other words, is made of past oceans. As Thea Goldring notes, to pick up a pastel crayon was to hold ancient life and its aqueous beginnings in one's hand. So pastels are paleobiological. This is not a contradiction, but an extension of their association with the tenuous capture of life, for it's precisely their relation to life's evanescence that aligns them with death. As Diderot put it in the 18th century, pastel is the perfect emblem of man who is only dust and will return to dust. We're all just a passing breeze through a biomineral dust cloud. When you look at a pastel drawing, you're simultaneously looking at a fleeting, fragile capture of a momentary passage and at a deep and unfathomable past. Pastel binds these timescales together. So there should be no embarrassment about this pastel. This friable dust gave us our first view of a friable, dusty planet, and the fossilized microorganisms that make up the medium are precisely the sort of things that we are now looking for in our Mars explorations. The medium of pastel is not so much frivolous or obsolete as it is perhaps astonishingly foresighted, so much that you have to wonder, was that box of pastels just waiting there in the Pasadena art store through the eons to help us understand our first encounter with Mars? I guess what I want to say is that NASA, you got it right on the first try. This provisional image spun up out of a flurry of staples and adrenaline is perhaps the truest image ever to come out of the Mars program. And I mean that it is true in the poetic sense, yes, but I also mean that in the scientific sense. In fact, I want to conclude by arguing that precisely because this pastel is so sensitive to the poetics of human experience, it is also able to detect and record astrophysical realities that have been hard to find in space images since. In fact, I even want to propose it as a foundation for an alternative future for space imaging. I'm not saying that we should literally start rendering all of our space imagery in pastel, but I do think that we need to find ways of recovering the kind of astrophysical insight that is locked in this drawing. In making this drawing, the engineers were forced to violate their own boundaries between art and science. They were forced to conspire with the whole history of art and ephemerality, to breathe in its dust. But in doing so, they saw things about Mars that we have since forgotten. Looking again at a comparison between the dust and the photograph. The photograph is clean. It cleans up all the anxiety and the desire and all that unruly powder. It smooths over the whole messy process of struggling to establish contact with a world in the dark. But in doing so, it also discards a lot of astronomy. Another way to put this is to say that the drawing knows things about Mars and space that the photograph does not. And I'll just finish by outlining two things. First, the drawing knows that Mars is achingly far away, and it knows that the Earth and Mars are immersed together in a dusty cosmic ecosystem. Let's start with the issue of distance. As we've seen, pastel is a technology for negotiating the impossible problem of immediacy. Artists working in pastel are attempting to capture the presence of something that's just out of sync with them, something fugitive or ephemeral. Pastel chases after but never quite achieves fleeting moments of connection in a non-synchronous universe. In the NASA pastel, we see this non-synchrony in the waiting and the longing and the reaching that still adhere tenuously to this fragile object. whereas the photograph presents the first glimpse of Mars as if it were an instantaneous capture, just plucked whole out of the flow of time like a snapshot. The drawing harbors all of the evidence of the image's original suspension in and emergence from durational experience. It's right there in the numbers and the strips. Louvered into the drawing is the entire history of its slow trickle to Earth. And of course, the pastel medium itself traces out the entire sequence of its own making. Every gesture is its own timestamp, its own record of an image that is always in the process of arriving to the hand and the eye. Now, it may seem obvious that the distance to an astronomical object is a pretty important thing to get across in a space image. But I would note that it is almost entirely absent from even the most advanced contemporary space imaging. Let's look at the Carina Nebula again. Don't get me wrong, I love this image. I love all Webb images. I'm a total astronomy super fan. I'm into all of this. This picture is astonishing, mind-bending, gobsmacking. It leaps forward in such astonishingly high resolution that the very word nebula, which is a term denoting vagueness from the Latin for cloud or mist, no longer even seems to apply. But it tells us nothing about the extreme remoteness of this thing that we're looking at. This star cloud is 7,500 light years away, an almost unfathomable distance. But it's presented to us within the structure of an illusion of proximity, even availability. And here on the screen, it comes to us in a format no different from a product in our Amazon shopping carts. This light left the Carina Nebula during the Neolithic period here on Earth, when, as I recently learned on Wikipedia, that when humans in what is now Poland had just figured out how to make cheese. We're given this image as if it were an instantaneous view, but actually we had to wait 7,500 years for this transmission. We cannot reach this cliff. We cannot have it. In a very real sense, we cannot even see it. There's an absolute intractable separation between us and anything we can perceive in outer space. Yes, we now have telescopes that can peer back to the dawn of the universe more than 13 billion light years away, but there is no telescope, no tool, no instrument that can show us even the surface of something as relatively close as Mars as it exists right now at this moment. Mars could be blown to smithereens as we sit here in the room, and we would not know it for about another 12 minutes. We can only see Mars as it existed 12 minutes ago. We can keep looking further and further out into space with better and better instruments, but all we will ever see there is the past. There is no present tense in space. Time is out of joint. We're alone in the vastness of the cosmos, looking to a vault of fossils and tombs. In a very real sense, we cannot see anything in the universe at all. The engineers in that room in JPL had no choice but to acknowledge this as they waited for the data to come down, no choice but to perform it as they struggled to push through the curtain of cosmological blindness with their Rembrandt soft pastels. In this sense, the pastel is, I think, superior to the Webb image because with this durational and emotional information, it also contains better astrophysical information. Finally, a note about dust. As we've seen, artists have historically used the dusty medium of pastel as a kind of visual technology for the experience of perceiving transient or faint phenomena. When the engineers used it to visualize their data, they did something similar. In doing so, they were actually eerily prescient about the fact that astronomy would soon go on to develop into a science of dust. Astronomers today look for dust throughout the universe, and more interestingly, they also look with dust. They use dust as a lens to locate, measure, and characterize distant phenomena. In mapping the history of cosmic dust, they have been able to model the origins of planetary systems. They've been able to show, for example, that Mars and the Earth and you and me and those sticks of Rembrandt soft pastel all coalesced from the same dust in the same protoplanetary disk around our sun 4.5 billion years ago. The image of outer space that we get from dust astronomy is one of immersion in an ancestral material commons, not one of isolated objects floating in a void. 6,000 tons of cosmic dust fall on the Earth every year. Faint clouds of dust persist around and between the planets. Perhaps in dark skies you have seen what's called the zodiacal light, a glow launching up along the ecliptic above the horizon just before dawn or after dark. Astronomers at JPL have recently mapped out the dust that causes this glow, and it turns out that it seems to be coming from Mars itself. We are actually swimming in Mars dust. We are breathing it. Elon Musk has been wearing his Occupy Mars t-shirts in the Oval Office. But it's ridiculous to think that we can occupy Mars because Mars already occupies us. Why does this matter? Given the state of the world today, isn't it escapist and self-indulgent to be working on space imaging? Well, while the humanities have not been paying attention, we have been barreling headfirst into a new commercialized space age that is brazenly extractive and almost completely unregulated. We have those Occupy Mars t-shirts, and we have the president reauthorizing Manifest Destiny by promising to put an American flag on Mars. Within our lifetimes, we may find microbial life on Mars or in one of the subsurface oceans on the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn. I'm worried about how we're going to treat that life if we find it. And so are all of the astrobiologists and planetary scientists whose funding is now being cut. Why is it even possible to assume that space is something that can be conquered and occupied? Why is it possible to think of it as a frontier? Perhaps it's because we've been given an image of space as an empty void filled with fully resolved, possessible objects, sitting at some indeterminate but not so distant distance from us. Perhaps we've been given an image of space that seems familiar, that seems to be part of the status quo. But that is not the space that we're given in this Mars pastel. Here we see that outer space is not a sector, it's not a territory, it's not a frontier. It's so vast that it resists possession and challenges everything we know, but it is not the outside. It's a commons and it's an ecosystem, one in which we are all immersed. It will not actually support our outdated habits of acquisition and instant gratification. It demands a new ethics and a new way of thinking and a new way of looking. Looking, I would submit, the way David would look at it, looking like a Martian. Thank you.